On climate change. I'm so happy to see so many people here. The mark of a successful conference for us is at the end of the day when we look throughout the audience and see every chair filled, even at 5 o'clock. And here we are bright and early in the morning, and again we have a near full house, and I presume it'll be pretty much entirely full within the next few minutes. So thank you all for your enthusiasm. Thank you for the wonderful questions that have been asked of our speakers and the delightful conversations that we've had between sessions and after sessions. It's been a fantastic conference, and I thank you all for being here. A few housekeeping notes this morning. First of all, I found something, well actually somebody else found something, some things that were green and in a paper clip. If you can tell me how much it is, it's yours. But anyway, this was, I believe it was not yesterday, but even the evening before, or perhaps in the morning yesterday. Paper clip, it was found in here on the floor, so. You bet it's yours. Don't they pay you enough at Colorado State, Bill? So you're being serious then? And you're correct. They are all $1 bills, which is why I didn't mind holding it up and even having someone bluff on it, because you're not going to miss it too much. But all right. Now, of course, if anyone would like to impugn the reputation of Dr. Bill Gray, come up and say it's yours instead for a measly $18. No. Dr. Gray, I do not accept bribes less than $100. No bribes less than $100. But thank you. One other note. The film The Boy Who Cried Wolf is, we're showing this just across the hall here. It's being shown during breaks. It's about the length of a break. So between sessions, if you'd like to see a fantastic movie on more regarding climate science, by all means. So that being said, I'd like to get things moving bright and early on time this morning. So I'd like to introduce the moderator for this keynote session. The Honorable Barry Brill is a former member of the New Zealand Parliament. He is also the chair of the New Zealand Climate Science Coalition. He does yeoman's work distributing science, getting the word out, and he will be introducing our keynote speaker. So, Barry Brill.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Barry Brill, and I have to confess that I'm a lawyer, not a climate change, not a climate scientist. The climate scientists have been bearing the heat and burden of the day for some 20 years. They've been grappling with the complexities of the issues of climate to the point where they've had an enormous degree of success. We heard from Mark Morano yesterday that polls show that more than half of the world now believe that the alarmists don't have a case. We've got the Ipcc report coming out with all the rebuttal you could hope for. We've got over 900 peer-reviewed papers. We have much to celebrate, but unfortunately it's not over. We can now win the debates, but we have to have the debates. And the Fourth Estate, whose role it normally is to facilitate public issues of this nature, are just not going to join in this particular debate. So that leaves us dependent to some degree on the arena of the courts. In New Zealand, the New Zealand Climate Change Coalition has issued proceedings against NIWA, which is our government agency, perhaps equivalent to the NOAA in this country, in which we've challenged the temperature record, the official New Zealand temperature record. We've been able to do that, or we hope we will succeed in doing that, on the basis that the agency operates under a statute which requires it to maintain accurate records, a statute that requires it to act effectively and to pursue excellence. None of those things are done with a temperature record which has been manipulated and doctored to show something quite different than what has actually occurred over the last century in the weather records of the country. That case is coming to an initial hearing within the next week, but it will continue for some time after that. We have another case pending, and it's really a regional planning tribunal which has decided to make provision for rising seas as a result of climate change. And we've lodged an objection to that provision, and that will go on up to the Environment Court and so into the appeal courts and the opportunity to consider sea levels. Now, I think we are going to need to do this all around the world. Our opponents have been using the courts very effectively for 30 or 40 years. It's quite fashionable for lawyers to give up any number of billable hours to work pro bono for the benefit and protection of the environment. Now, we are going to need to persuade many more of our colleagues that it's even more important for them to operate pro bono for the protection of jobs, for the protection of the economy, for the protection of our way of life. And I believe that this process has started, as you've already seen in decisions by the Montana Supreme Court and indeed the Supreme Court of the United States. But the big king hit will be the IPCC report of 2013. Not necessarily the whole report, but in particular the detection and attribution chapter in which there's going to be a further affirmation or not of the anthropogenic cause of climate change. Now, the recent renewables paper issued by that body was a complete catechism of how not to undertake public decision-making. If you apply for a dog's license, the administrative decision-maker knows that there are rules, conventions, requirements that are not negotiable. They must not be predetermined. There must be no indication of bias. There must be no conflicts of interest. They must consider all the factors that are relevant. They must not consider all the factors that are irrelevant. Now, this applies throughout the whole common law world, and in every minor matter, decisions that are taken day by day all the time. And yet in this United Nations body, involving all the countries of the world, with an issue which is going to involve trillions of dollars, every one of those rules are being broken. Now, I'm not standing here to tell you I know what to do about it, but I want to suggest that we need to find ways of having those people, of having the IPCC believe that their work will be reviewed, will be put under a microscope, that they will be called to account for observing the everyday rules on how to make decisions of major importance. And so I hope that we'll move more into this in future conferences of this nature, and that we'll have a role for lawyers alongside all the climate scientists who have contributed so much to the issue. It's my pleasure now to introduce the keynote speaker for this morning. Bob Carter literally requires no introduction. He's one of the few, if maybe the only person who has addressed, I think, all 6 of the Heartland conferences to date. So I'll just mention what he's done since the conference in Chicago. He's he's added somewhat to his impressive record of achievements, one of which, incidentally, is that he's a New Zealander. He's published the book, Climate, the Counter-Consensus, which has been acclaimed very widely. In addition to being the doyen of climate change in the South Pacific and indeed throughout the Southern Hemisphere, he's joined the NIMSI board of editors in North America, and he's joined the Academic Council of Advisors for the Global Warming Policy Foundation in the United Kingdom. So he continues to spread his influence, and we continue to have the benefit of hearing from him. So I have pleasure in inviting Bob to address the conference.
Thank you for those kind words, Barry, and I did like the bit "or not" about the IPCC attributing climate change to our activities. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Joe Bast and his staff in particular for organising this magnificent conference and for inviting me to give this talk. Now, I have a bit of a reputation for not being up with the play sometimes, and as you will see, I'm apparently under the impression I'm at a former conference here. Now, there's a reason for that, two reasons I'm showing this slide. The first is to show that I have form on talking about the scientific method, because in a small room down the end of a long corridor to a very small audience at this conference, I spoke about testing hypotheses in climate change, and I'm very happy to see that now come the focus of a whole conference. The second reason I want to share it with you is I want to share with you this formerly unpublished picture of the IPCC meeting in Cancun last year. You will see a room filled with people in a state of religious fervour. You will see them being whipped to further fervour by this gentleman here brandishing the devil and the witch. And you will see a lady from the World Wildlife Fund down here giving birth to rabbits. Now, in this entire picture, there is one sane individual, and it's this gentleman here outside the window looking in, smoking a pipe, and that gentleman, ladies and gentlemen, represents you and me. So that summarises the problem. My title today, and now I'm pleased to tell you I'm at the right conference, is The Story of the Black Swan. Eastern Australia, the subject of this majestic map, first made by Captain James Cook and New Zealand before it in 1770, is a part of the world, of course, that you all know about. This is the tiny cockle shell of a boat that he navigated through these waters. He was accompanied by a scientist who was even then, a young Joseph Banks, was a fellow of the Royal Society of London. He went on to become one of the distinguished long-serving presidents of the Society. And it's interesting that this expedition was actually a science and an exploration expedition. And therefore, the people involved, the scientists involved, just like us today, knew their job as scientists was to test hypotheses. Well, in typical friendly Australian fashion, they were greeted on the shores of Botany Bay with this sort of welcoming party, and nothing changes in 240 years, because if you've been following the news in the last few days, you'll have heard that our friend Chris Monckton is getting a similarly friendly reception in Australia right now. Yes, well, a couple of days after they'd anchored in Botany Bay, Captain Cook and Joseph Banks did what explorers do in those circumstances. They went for a bit of a row in the surroundings, and of course Captain Cook was standing up in the stern of the boat, and Banks was there, and Cook said, "Mr. Banks, did you see that?" And Mr. Banks said, "What, Captain?" "Mr. Banks, did you see that?" "Mr. Banks, that was a black swan." "Oh," said Mr. Banks, "yeah, that can't be right, Captain. You and I know, we have a hypothesis." All swans are white. We know all swans are white. Well, said Captain Cook, Mr. Banks, there it is. It's come down on the water. Swans here are black. Now, the black swan has a long part of Australian history, and this is those stamp collectors amongst you will recognise this. It's called the inverted black swan from the state of Western Australia. There are only 16 mint copies, and they go for $60,000 a pop. Of course, being a scientist, as in parentheses, I have to have a hypothesis about this. And my hypothesis is that the printer, this isn't a mistake with the upside-down swan. It was actually deliberate, and it was the printer letting his friends back in England know that he now lived in this place down under. And, and I believe the reason Australia is so appreciated in the alliance with the US is that we can be relied upon to provide this inverted thinking, as it were, on most topics. So moving to testing hypotheses, there are two hypotheses of the day that I want to talk about. Global warming has occurred since 1958. That's a testable hypothesis. And the second one is that the greenhouse hypothesis is true. The greenhouse hypothesis is not, as reporters every day ask us climate scientists, is climate change happening then, Bob? The greenhouse hypothesis is that human carbon dioxide emissions are causing dangerous global warming. That is the hypothesis we wish to test. So let's do that against a record from the radiosonde measurements since 1958, and this particular paper closed off in 2002. Now, I'm aware that there are many criticisms to be made of this data set, but it has to be said that after the satellite record, which starts, of course, in 1979 here, this is the most accurate record we have of the earlier years. So, addressing hypothesis one, global warming's occurred since 1958, and the answer is, well, it depends. And it depends how you choose to look at the data. You can say that the temperature in 1979 was the same as the temperature in 2002, and we know from the satellite record it's the same as the temperature out here in 2011. Or you can say, no, Bob, you're a scientist, you should fit a line through that data. Here's the line, and a small amount of global warming occurred over those 25 or so years. So that's fine, but the problem is, what about this? And of course, between 1958 and 1979, and note in 58 the temperature was the same as 79 and so on, but there's this cooling trend of the same magnitude but the opposite direction to the warming trend here, and that over this period of time carbon dioxide went up by 18%. And in fact, if you come out to 2011, we've still got a red dot on the central line, or the zero axis, and it's gone up by more than 20%. So we've had an increase of more than 20% in carbon dioxide, and global temperature has not only not warmed dangerously, it hasn't warmed at all. Hands up, those of you in the room that are under 52 years of age. There's been no global warming in your lifetime. It's really quite remarkable. Well, that's a black swan. And of course, this is a white swan. This is consistent with the hypothesis. But we all know that no matter how many facts we see that are consistent with the hypothesis, that does not prove the hypothesis. It's always provisional, and along comes the black swan. Well, it turns out that you only need to see one black swan, but the guys on the other side and the media that have already been referred to are slow learners. Boy, are they slow learners. So you need a few more black swans, and here they are. I'm not going to go into the details. They'll be familiar to most of you in the room. I don't have the time. But you're all aware of the missing upper troposphere hotspot, the fact the GCMs, as tested against reality, are inaccurate, the fact that the sensitivity of the GCMs is overestimated, as judged against empirical data, the fact that the temperature rate of change in the late 20th century fell well within the natural rate, and so did the magnitude of the late 1998 temperature peak, is well within previous geological peaks. And finally, temperature leads to carbon dioxide change in the ice cores. A veritable cornucopia of black swans. So, here we have 7 black swans a-swanning. Now, from the left, we have Jim Hansen, we have Phil Jones, we have Tom Wigley, we have Tim Flannery, and we have Michael Schmidt. These are very intelligent people, and I do not say that in any way to put them down. It is astonishing that they cannot see that flock of black swans heading their way. Just astonishing. Note that our simple test using just the radiosonde temperature record has invalidated both of those hypotheses. That is the way that science works, or used to before it became postmodern science. Okay, so much for black swans. Now I want to give you two examples of postmodern science in action as accomplished by the major agencies who are charged with providing our temperature and climate statistics. And first example is the one that Barry Brill's already referred to, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research in New Zealand. They carry the obligation to advise the government on this. If you go to their website and poke around a bit, you'll find this is their recommended temperature record from 1910 to 2010, and you'll see that they have a warming slope here of a little bit less than a degree per century. And this is called the 7-station series because it comes from these 7 red dots scattered throughout New Zealand, and you could say that's geographically more or less representative, but you need to remember that the subantarctic front, the major oceanic heat barrier and transfer thing, sits in here. So the country is very long in latitudinal terms, and it does span a lot of climate zones, and you can arguably say 7 stations are not enough, but whatever, this is the 7-station record that is used. So it's been in the official temperature record since 1993, but it's based on a PhD thesis by Jim Salinger, who has been, until recently, a NIWA employee. And his thesis was done in 1981, and the methods that he used to correct and provide this temperature record have been lost. The original records, there is no record at NIWA, and this is what Barry was speaking about in terms of accountability, who's accountable for that, that enables you to go back precisely and reconstruct how that record has been arrived at. So, interesting, 1910 this starts, but wasn't New Zealand settled? Yes, it was, in the 1840s by Europeans. Didn't they have thermometers? Yes, they did. Well, that's interesting. So if you ferret around a bit more on NIWA's site, you'll find this record. And here we go back to 1855 or so, and here is the same warming, but goodness gracious me, that's rather like the radiosondes, isn't it? There's a cooling before that, almost of greater magnitude. Why didn't NIWA want to share that with everybody? Well, it gets worse, because you can go in and you can pull out the data for that, and you can replot it, and look what happens. This trend completely disappears. There's no warming whatsoever over the last 150 years. Now, the gentleman that did this is a Mr. Richard Treadgold, who is one of the members of the New Zealand Climate Science Coalition. And I'll show you in the next slide some of his further work. This is unpublished work at the moment, but it will be germane and probably discovered during the court case that Barry spoke about. So this is the official record. This is the actual data plotted up with no modifications. Richard Treadgold went on, and taking one of the 7 stations now, this one happens to be Auckland, he examined what happens if you remove the corrections made in Jim Salinger's thesis. And you can see straight away what happens. Here's the Salinger version and the official New Zealand version, and here's the version with no corrections. There's a warming trend, but it's so small it's scarcely discernible. That was this Auckland station here, and the red is the NIWA record of substance. The green is the, I've got this right, can't read that. The green is the unadjusted, and the blue is the record as was claimed to have been adjusted by Jim Salinger using a method published in the literature. And you see that in every case, the adjusted records have added substantial warming. Now, I stress this is not yet peer-reviewed work, but it will be discovered during the court case, so I take it as established. If we then average those 7 records, we get the same sort of thing as for Auckland. Here's the trend on the adjusted NIWA record, and here's the reality trend, which is down to about 0.3 degrees per century. Nothing to be alarmed about at all. Well, in trying to get the information out, Freedom of Information Act was used, and no fewer than 71 parliamentary questions were asked in the New Zealand Parliament to try and dig out these adjustment calculations, which in the end were shown to be lost. It was also shown that the calculations for the adjusted records did not follow the Rhodes and Salinger paper in the International Journal of Climatology for recommending correction of records. And other issues with the record include urban heat island effect, the climate regionality I've already spoken about, and the fact that this is maverick statistics because this method claimed to have been used was not in fact used. Well, here's the New Zealand Climate Science Coalition, and that's the situation that NIWA finds itself in at the moment. So, the coalition requested NIWA to withdraw this official record. Are you surprised? They declined. So what they did instead was they undertook their own review to reconstruct a temperature record, and here it is plotted over the Jim Salinger version, and you can only just see there's two colours there, they're so similar. The chances of replicating, given the complexity of the data, those curves so exactly are 0, but it's happened. Even better, it's got the imprimatur of peer review. It's actually mates review. Staff of the staff of the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia agreed they would review this document. Part of the court thing at the moment is to try and get out their actual written statement. The only statement that they've made is, in general, the evidence provided by NIWA supports the homogeneity corrections that have been applied to the temperature record. And what that actually says is, the material NIWA provided us with supports the conclusions that they drew. It's got nothing to do with peer review whatsoever, and Bureau of Meteorology in Australia did not examine the original records and data. They have just read the report. So, as a result of that, and led by Barry Brill, the action was launched in the High Court that you see here, and an order has been sought to declare that the New Zealand temperature record is not a full and accurate record, to set aside the Seven Stations record as the official record, an order precluding NIWA from using this record for purposes of giving advice to the public or the government, and an order requiring NIWA to publish a replacement, but a full and an accurate record of the average surface temperature. Now, of course, those are the four substantive requests. The fifth one's just as important, which is the request for costs to be awarded. Well, so much so then for the example from New Zealand. Let's now look at an example from Australia. Professor Will Steffen runs a large research group at the ANU in Canberra, Climate Change Research Group. He is the advisor to the Department of Climate Change. Just after she was elected last year, the new Prime Minister, Julia Gillard, gave a promise in the election campaign: there will be no carbon dioxide tax under any government I lead. She was then forced to back down from that because she had to go into coalition with the Greens to form a government. It's a minority government. And she set up an Ipcc. What on earth's that? It's a multi-party climate change committee. And it sits in Canberra, and it is determining right at the moment what the price of the carbon tax is going to be. Professor Will Steffen is the advisor to that committee, as well as being advisor to the Department of Climate Change. And a little while ago, his presentation that he gave to that committee when they first convened, this was the summary of the science they had to have before they set out on policy setting determinations. So this is Professor Will Steffen saying to the committee, and remember, the committee is chaired by the Prime Minister. Doesn't get much heavier than that. This is the committee that is determining the fate of Australia in these terms. Now, the slideshow has 18 slides in it. They have been dissected by this group of scientists, myself and David Evans, Stuart Franks, and Bill Kinnemonth, and that's posted on a website, Quadrant Online, and we have published a full critique of that. I only have time today to do one slide, which is Professor Steffen's last slide. So this was Professor Steffen's bottom line to the committee. Prime Minister, he said, the Earth is warming with 100% certainty. Of course, the reality is the Earth is either warming or cooling with 100% certainty, in neither case dangerously. Whether it's warming or cooling is entirely a function of the length of the piece of climate string you choose to cut off. In the last 10 years, all of you know, it's been cooling just slightly. Last 30 years, it's been warming. Last 10,000 years, which is my perspective as a geologist, we are in a long-term cooling trend. So that first statement is completely untrue as a bald scientific statement. His second piece of advice was human emissions of greenhouse gases are the main cause of the warming observed over the last half century, at least about 95% certainty. Now, you'll recognize the wording of this. It comes from the IPCC, but you'll say, hang on, Bob, didn't the IPCC say 90% certainty? Yeah, they did. So what's happened? Well, we're down under. Things grow legs down under. Somehow, 90% certainty is morphed into 95% certainty with no explanation given whatsoever. But basically, this is a restatement of what's in the fourth assessment report. The reality is that no evidence exists that measurable, note the word measurable, late 20th century warming was caused by human carbon dioxide emissions. The statement of 95% certainty is fraudulent. No statistical analyses exist that can justify such a wild assertion. That's quite a heavy criticism to make in public. Am I sure? Of course I'm sure. Here's the advice from the IPCC to their lead authors. When you are using these words, your considered opinion as a group of people sitting around a table, you will say there is a 90% probability for what you judge to be very likely. This is fraudulent science, and that's all you need to know about the IPCC, basically, to dismiss most of what they write. It's not that there isn't a lot of good stuff in their reports, there is, but how do you know which is the good stuff and which is the fraudulent stuff? Okay, so what should have been written there is that. 3, despite considerable uncertainty about the specific consequences of climate change in the future, we know that the risks to society and environment are very large and are growing as we gain more knowledge. How about that? Well, what he's thinking of here, of course, is the more droughts, fewer droughts, more rain, less rain, warmer, cooler, whatever, more polar bears, less polar bears. It's all consistent with dangerous global warming, and it's all because you bought a second SUV. Okay, so let's look at just 2 examples. Here we are. I understand you had a bit of a problem with the Mississippi a few months ago. In Australia, we had the same problem with the Brisbane River, which flowed through half of Brisbane. This is the size of the flood. A bit over 4 metres on the flood gauge. Within 2 days, it was all over the newspapers that this was due to global warming. And here are the 2 floods in the late 19th century, which were double. They were over 8 metres. And given this record is only 150 years long, you don't need to think that those are the biggest floods that have ever come down the Brisbane River. So that's one example. Another example from the Great Barrier Reef here. This is similar to the work Fred referred to yesterday. Oxygen isotope analyses from speleothems in caves, and the oxygen isotope analysis gives you an indication of rainfall intensity, and that can be translated into the magnitude of cyclones. And the black line here separates cyclones above that are of intense or super intense nature from your average run-of-the-mill cyclone down here. And you straight away see that there are 7 events during the Little Ice Age between 1600 and 1800, and there is 1 event which barely makes it during the warmer 19th and 20th centuries. So the idea that there's something unusual about the magnitude or the number of any of these major weather disasters today is an interesting idea to propose. There is no empirical evidence for it that I know of anywhere in the world. So what Professor Stephan should have written here was, there is no evidence that the risks of climate change and hazardous climate-related events are changing. No evidence at all. It is certain that hazardous natural climate events and change will continue, quite irrespective of whether you have 2 or 3 SUVs. Now, I want to pause and reflect something that many of you know, if you know anything of what I've written, which is my firm belief that this is the real hazard and that governments do have a duty to have a climate policy, and it should be to prepare for and adapt to all natural climate events. If and when a human signal becomes visible and it is dangerous, and those are 2 big ifs, but if that happens, we have prepared to deal with natural climate change. We will, in the same way, deal with any human change. The 4th point, the scientific basis and imperative for rapid and vigorous action to reduce emissions is overwhelming. Decarbonisation again. I mean, what does that mean? That's another one of these trendy jargon words. Did you know, ladies, there's going to be a tax on your wedding ring? It's just total nonsense. But never mind, it's the lingo. Decarbonisation of the economy by 2050 is required to meet the 2% guardrail. What on earth is that? That's that number that they plucked out of the air at a meeting in Exeter in 2005. They were sitting around the table talking, and somebody says, the politicians won't listen to us. We keep on saying it's very dangerous, but they want a number. What's the number for dangerous warming? I thought, well, 2 degrees. And ever since, that has stuck, and it's in the government speak of every Western country through the IPCC. There is not a shred of empirical evidence that 2 degrees warmer than today is other than environmentally beneficial. The world actually does better from our human perspective in warmer times than it does in colder times. So what should have been written here, no scientific justification exists for assuming that a 2-degree warming, should it occur, would be dangerous. The term guardrail is therefore inappropriate as our policies aimed at achieving it. I pause to reflect that what's underneath that was the advice given to a middle-ranking Western nation's Prime Minister and Cabinet in terms of the evidence, scientific evidence, for a carbon dioxide tax. It is disgraceful. Okay. The question then to ask is, what's the Australian public doing about this? And on Monday this week, there was a new opinion poll published, or this point on the opinion poll was added in the Australian. It's a better opinion poll than most. It doesn't ask that ridiculous question, do you believe in climate change, that is much loved of the liberal media. It actually asked which of these statements comes closest to your point of view, and the statements are longer than this, but basically, do you think global warming is a serious and pressing problem that you should spend significant money on now, or do you think it's not urgent but should be addressed gradually in low-cost steps, or do you think until we are sure we should spend no money? And I don't need to explain the trend on the graph, it's obvious. What is interesting is that ClimateGate sits in there. And this is a steeper decline than occurred during the ClimateGate year. What's also interesting is that the big change here, increase and decrease there, those rates are high. So in 2010 through to 11, whatever the reason, and maybe it is the effectiveness of the people in this room and our colleagues elsewhere, there has been an acceleration in this public opinion. The foreign editor for the Australian, a much respected gentleman called Greg Sheridan, wrote of this, the Australian people have been magnificently immune to the oceans of propaganda Garnow, he's the government's appointed climate advisor, and other agents of the government's carbon machine have produced. Isn't that a wonderful statement? The Australian people are better than the government's advisors. Okay, so I need to return to hypothesis testing for a moment. This is from Lucia Lilligren's interesting blog, and she spends much time analysing. In faint grey here is the temperature record from 2001 to 2010, and she then fits the linear fit through there, and these are the error bars, and here's the IPCC computer projection, and of course they're way outside the error bars. So the IPCC still predicts, or projects I should say, that warming is occurring and will go on occurring. The real world has another opinion, and this is our old friend, Black Swan number 3. So, Black Swans, again. Computer models. The Black Swan should have done the damage to the computer model. It hasn't. They still just go on repeating them as if they're God's truth. Here's John Mitchell, who's the chief research scientist at the British Meteorological Office. He's not now, but he was. At a meeting in Cambridge in May this year, he made the remarkable statement, people underestimate the power of models. Observational evidence is not very useful. Our approach is not entirely empirical. Whoever would have guessed that? Now, I have some advice for John Mitchell, and it's also what I would like you to take away with you, ladies and gentlemen. And it's this. Real scientists test hypotheses against facts. Please remember the power of the black swan. Thank you.